very much, Lawrence. It's always a great pleasure to be in Melbourne, and it's particularly a great pleasure to be in Melbourne on the last weekdays of September, as I have found over the last couple of years. I'm extremely honoured to be here, and very touched that so many of you have come this evening, more particularly since you also had an event here yesterday, I understand, with the new Australian ambassador to Burma. Obviously, you have not heard the story of the doctor, the diplomat, and the general, where the three of them had been captured by the enemy and they were to be executed tomorrow morning. But they were each asked, well, on your last day on earth, what would you like to do? So the doctor says, well, I've spent all my life healing people and so on. So if I could spend the day in the operating theatre trying to help people, then I could go happily. Then they turn to the diplomat and he says, well, you know, if I could give one last long speech to a wonderful audience, just like you, then I would be also ready to go. Then they turn to the general and they ask the general, what would you like, your last wish? And he just says, can you shoot me before his speech? So I think you needed, obviously, this is an audience that obviously needed to be warned. You're coming 2 days in a row for such an event. Europe navigating through the current crisis, and I would add to that as a title, an exercise in resilience, and you'll see why in a few minutes. The current economic crisis in Europe is serious. To quote President Van Rompuy, the President of the European Council, that's the group of European leaders and heads of state and heads of government, it is much more than just about monetary operations. The European project itself is at stake. A serious crisis demands a serious response, and that is exactly what it is getting from European leaders. Why? Simply because the European Union matters. Because Europeans have experienced in the past, tragically, what happens if we all go it alone. And because we must join forces today if we are to count among the global players of tomorrow. Again, that was President Van Rompuy. To fully understand why and how the EU is navigating successfully through this crisis, it is useful to reflect on the fact that the EU is very resilient. It has evolved through facing up to various crises, and the current crisis is another example of this resilience in action. Resilient systems are those which adapt in the face of challenges. The European Union is a political creation. European countries decided freely and democratically to establish it, and, over time, to widen the range of policy issues which it deals with. Crises have often played an important role in persuading European countries that their national interests would be better served through doing more things together, what we sometimes describe as more Europe, doing more things together and not fewer. Crises present policy options in stark terms. They confront us with the price of not cooperating more deeply, as well as the advantages of cooperation. They help us to move the political debate forward. Ideas rejected previously become more acceptable. Of course, this is not particular to the European Union or to individual countries, but nonetheless, when speaking of how, what, or when the EU might do something next, it is a key point to bear in mind. There are many examples. The EU was, after all, born out of war to prevent war in the future, such that Europe had seen every 50 years down through the centuries. We had a euro sclerosis in the 1980s, which led to the realization that we needed to tackle the range of national non-tariff barriers which were holding back the full economic potential of our EU single market, leading to the 1992 single market drive, which has unified so many previously fragmented markets within Europe. The tragic Balkan Wars of the 1990s gave the political impetus for the EU to develop a much stronger common foreign policy and to give itself real security tools to help implement it. Because of this, it was possible for EU soldiers to replace NATO soldiers in Bosnia and in the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. Because of this, there was an EU military air operation, the first ever, against Somali pirates some months ago, destroying pirates' boats and fuel supplies. There are other examples, but I don't have time to list them all. But the basic point remains the same, namely that crises have fueled greater economic and political cooperation within Europe. I'd like to focus on two main themes. Firstly, that the European Union is more resilient, both economically and politically, than many people might realize. And secondly, that the current economic crisis is demonstrating this resilience through the measures being taken. The economic resilience of the European Union is not to be underestimated. It comes from the fact that the EU represents a large, open, competitive economic area. The European Union has a huge internal or single market, comprising over 500 million consumers, 23 million companies situated across 27 countries, accounting for around 20% of global GDP. In terms of value, it is almost 3 times the size of the Chinese market. In this Europe without borders, companies operate according to a single rule book. You may have heard of EU red tape, that European companies face a myriad of regulations. The European Commission is very conscious of reducing the administrative burdens on economic operators wherever possible, and this is an ongoing process. Nonetheless, the often hidden aspect of EU regulation is that it has freed up the European marketplace, replacing 27 different, often more complicated, sets of national regulations. This means, for example, that a product which can be sold in, let's say, Estonia, can be sold anywhere else within the EU market, whether in the UK, Portugal, Slovenia, Ireland. European regulation has harmonized standards across countries. It has opened up restricted markets. It has reduced costs to consumers. Competition policy alone putting over €7 billion into the pockets of EU citizens due to antitrust measures. However, we can go further, and the European Commission will soon make proposals on expanding the single market. But this huge single market encourages EU companies to be global in their search for competitive inputs and forces EU suppliers to sharpen up their products. 2/3 of what Europe exports involves imported components. Externally, Europe is the world's largest trader, possessing a very competitive open market with very low tariffs, slightly lower than Australia's. Over half of Europe's non-agricultural imports enter the market duty-free, as does 41% of our agricultural imports. The EU accounts for 15 or 16% of world trade in goods and 25% of the world's trade in services. While we can be rightly proud of what we have achieved, namely the most internationally competitive economic space, we are nonetheless aware that there's still more to be done. But if you believe in the economic dynamism which comes from trade and economic liberalization, then you must be positive about the European Union's large, open market and the underlying economic resilience which that provides. Europe also benefits from a political resilience. The underlying political resilience of the European Union is less apparent to outsiders, but it is no less important, derived as it is from the unique method of cooperation between European sovereign states. The pooling of sovereignty is at the heart of the European Union, but it is hard to understand from outside the system. Basically, it means agreeing to find EU-level solutions to EU-wide problems. This involves, in a practical sense, monthly meetings of ministers from the 27 member countries across a wide range of portfolios. Together, they strive to reach genuine European solutions rather than purely national ones. A huge premium is placed on dialogue and the search for consensus. Concepts such as solidarity and partnership are ever present, tempering the pursuit of pure national interest at all costs. EU leaders met 5 times in the first half of this year. They know each other well. Deals are struck in trust. Credibility is everything. This gives a strong political resilience which is not visible from the outside. Imagine for a moment what this sort of system would mean for Australia, were it part of such a regional integration project with its neighbours. Even internally, within the Commonwealth, how frequently do Australian state ministers meet to nut out Australian-wide solutions together? The EU has its own unique institutional and legal system to ensure fair play, with special roles for the European Commission and the European Court of Justice. This way of working together for over 50 years has made it more natural for member countries to participate in finding solutions which work for the EU as a whole, rather than just to look for narrow national advantage. National interests still matter, but they can also be served through finding the solution at the European level. Sometimes the political rhetoric from Europe might seem to indicate a greater degree of disagreement than is actually the case. And sometimes, however, there is real disagreement between leaders. But this is all the more visible today, precisely because it has become so unusual. What is much more common is for a vigorous political debate to yield the sort of European solutions which I mentioned a moment ago. Agreements which bring 27 countries together along the same path and which bring Europe as a whole further. The current economic crisis is no different. It is a crisis which is prompting a European renewal. It demonstrates the resilience of the EU system as it addresses the strains within the system. Europe has shown the ability to recognize the problems, to devise new tools to handle the crisis, and to refine those new tools in the light of changing circumstances. Already today we can see many important measures taken by Europe in reaction to the economic crisis over the past 24 months. To improve the functioning of the euro system, we created the firewall funds, now totaling over 700 billion euro. First for Greece, then 3 weeks later for other member states if they might need them. Firstly, we created them as a temporary fund, and then several months later we changed it into a permanent fund. These measures show solidarity, innovation, and the refinement of an already new tool all in one. Resilience, in other words. Again, to improve the functioning of the euro system, we agreed a much tighter degree of economic policy coordination, whereby member states expose their economic and fiscal policy ideas to a very close peer scrutiny by both the EU institutions and the other European states. As part of this, the member states have agreed that whenever the European Commission proposes financial sanctions against a member state for failure to implement important economic policy recommendations, it will no longer need a majority vote in favour of the sanction. Instead, it will require a majority vote against the sanction for it not to go through. This reversal of the majority voting mechanism shows the determination of the European member states to ensure that the rules are properly applied by themselves and by each other. To stabilise the financial markets, the European Central Bank has intervened. It will do all in its power in line with the reforms undertaken by those euro countries which are needing help. To reduce the cost of money and to regain financial credibility in the markets, the member states have engaged upon fiscal consolidation reforms which are as painful as they are necessary. And the depth and difficulty of these measures have given us some dramatic pictures from Europe over recent months. However, the results are becoming evident, as noted recently by the President of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi. I quote, "Across the euro area, strong budgetary consolidation is taking place. The International Monetary Fund forecasts that the euro area's primary budgetary position will be almost in balance this year. This means that, apart from debt service, all other expenditures are covered by current revenues. This is quite an achievement in an international context. Japan, for example, will have a 9% of GDP primary deficit this year, the US 6%, and the UK more than 5%. And the euro area is not only performing well on average, each individual country will have a primary budget deficit lower than these three countries. It is those countries most in need that are making the largest adjustments. So the measures are working. To regain competitiveness, the member states have engaged upon a whole range of structural economic reforms, introducing greater flexibility into the labour market, addressing demographic issues through rising pension ages, striking a better balance between taxation and social benefits, and making their economies more business friendly. As The Economist put it not so long ago, I quote, "Visit the Eurozone and you will be invigorated by gusts of reform." Important improvements are taking place in terms of competitiveness. For example, the countries under full EU IMF programs have seen unit labour costs improve by around 10% since 2008, relative to the euro area average. This has translated into current account deficits that are on average more than 5 percentage points of GDP lower than they were then. And this is not only due to lower imports, but also rising exports induced by better competitiveness. Across Europe, the challenge of competitiveness is being faced up to. Spain has almost eliminated its pre-GFC current account deficit of minus 10% and is a net exporter to the other Eurozone countries. Portugal has reduced its current account deficit by 2/3. Greece's exports are rising faster than those of any other EU member state. Labour market flexibility is improving across Europe, especially in Spain and Portugal. The fifth review of the support programme for Portugal very recently concluded that the programme of reforms is on track. Ireland is making great progress across the board, resulting in steady inward investment flows and in it being able to re-enter the financial markets last June. In Italy, Prime Minister Monti is tackling monopolies and red tape, bringing increased competition to certain parts of the economy. And in Greece, very tough measures are being taken by the new government to turn things around. It is not easy, but the Greek people have voted for parties committed to the euro and committed to these reforms. And to strengthen financial sector regulation, we have created a new EU tier of supervisory authorities, including a European Systemic Risk Board, to complement the roles of the national supervisory authorities. Such EU supervisory authorities could have helped prevent the rise of unbalanced significant asset price bubbles in certain member states. These are measures already taken or being taken, but the crisis demands more. Accordingly, there is an ongoing policy discussion in which various ideas are being canvassed. The EU is remarkable at incremental change. It is not well suited to instant, dramatic, magic solutions. Nor is the complexity of the crisis susceptible to simple once-off definitive solutions, despite the clamour for such a simplistic way forward from some quarters. As part of the ongoing step-by-step approach, we see that every time the EU leaders meet, there are important decisions taken. At the June European Council, the heads of state and government decided on various issues. They agreed an action plan for growth and jobs, a roadmap for actions to support employment, especially for the youth, with measures at both the national and the European levels, measures totaling 120 billion euro of investment. They agreed on a unitary patent, reducing the costs of innovation, especially important for small and medium-sized enterprises, and facilitating the commercialization of innovative ideas. They agreed to increase the capital of the European Investment Bank by 100 million, thereby increasing its lending capacity by 180 million. They agreed on the principle of a single bank supervisory mechanism for all euro area banks. Also at that meeting in June, the President of the European Council, that's to say the Chairman of the Council, Herman Van Rompuy, presented a report to EU leaders to help stimulate the debate on what's called moving towards a genuine economic and monetary union. The report sets out 4 key interrelated areas for consideration. A banking union, where a single banking supervisor is needed to commensurate with a system for common resolution of bank failures. A fiscal union, where strengthened solidarity mechanisms and central enforcement mechanisms are needed to avoid unsustainable government deficits. An economic union to improve competitiveness of the euro area as a whole. And finally, deeper political union to ensure that all these measures are underpinned by increased democratic legitimacy and accountability. This debate is launched, and it will continue with an interim report next month and a final report for the December European Council. But things are moving quickly. Earlier this month, the European Commission President, José Manuel Barroso, submitted his technical proposals concerning the single supervisory banking authority, which he proposed should be an extra role for the European Central Bank. But this is not just a debate about technical measures. Instead, it is a deeply political debate about fairness, about responsibility, about solidarity. Fundamentally, it is about the implications of being part of a wider European community beyond one's own national border. Taken together, all these measures, both those already taken and those now being discussed, show again the resilience of the EU system, that it is facing up to the challenges of the economic crisis with courage, determination, and imagination. In conclusion, Europe continues to renew itself. The European Union has a proven history of growing stronger in difficult times. Challenges motivate us to improve and carry on. There has been the tendency of markets and commentators to belittle the far-reaching measures already taken and the complexity of moving forward 27 democracies. It is simply wrong to say, as some have written earlier this year in Australia, that the European Union is dead, or that it was a, quote, wrong turning of history. Such views are grossly inaccurate, and they profoundly misunderstand the European Union. Nonetheless, this current crisis is special, and as I said at the beginning, the European project itself is at stake. President Van Rompuy recently called the euro a game changer. He said that previously the European project was often spoken of in abstract and idealistic terms, that the EU's achievements affected people's lives always in positive terms. Complaints about milk quotas apart, the EU always represented a win-win situation. On this point, President Van Rompuy is worth quoting at a little length. I quote, "With the euro crisis, for the first time, citizens are confronted with the hard fact that some costs come alongside the benefits. For instance, the costs and efforts to defend a common currency during a financial crisis. Citizens are also realizing now for the first time that they are in this together, that what happens in another country with banks, bubbles or budgets affects them too. The crisis has revealed what it takes to be in a union. In fact, he calls this the very first test of solidarity in the history of the union. He says, of course there are tensions and constraints. There is opposition and critique. There are caricatures and cartoons. And yet, a gigantic collective effort is taking place, involving all Euro countries, all EU institutions, all citizens to muster the political will, the parliamentary majorities, and the means to come out of this together. It is de facto solidarity of an unprecedented magnitude." And he ends by urging, nobody should underestimate this political determination. I would just briefly add, the European vision has delivered global political and economic benefits, and in overcoming this crisis, it will continue to do so in the future. Our track record is incredible. Europe has, after all, come a very long way since it was founded almost 60 years ago by 6 countries dealing with issues primarily relating to coal and steel. Thank you for your attention.